MIDI control within Stochas and MIDI output is split over two different options. Firstly, MIDI output. Each layer can have a different MIDI channel output. So if you're using, let's say for instance, Pro Tools, and you want to send the MIDI to different tracks, or you're using something like Contact by Native Instruments, where you can have multiple MIDI inputs into the device, you can set it using the output. Controlling the MIDI in Stochas, you've got two different options. Firstly, you've got the output MIDI channel. So you can have one copy of Stochas run 4 different hardware units or 4 different synths, and you can just change the MIDI channel here, and this is a per layer option. So you can have layer 1 controlling one instrument, layer 2 a different instrument, and layer 3 a different one, but use all the facilities of writing within one copy of Stochas, so that you don't lose yourself as to which instance of Stochas you're in, or you've got it all here in one. But Stochas can be controlled by MIDI input, and this has been set up for playback and for recording purposes. And you've got the first option here, respond to MIDI. So when that's ticked yes, this MIDI mapping comes into play. Now, just like with any other controllable synth where you can assign expressions or different controls can be controlled by different key presses or different CC controllers and buttons and dials, Stochas can be set that way as well. So we've got these options here. Let's work backwards across. We've got the MIDI channel that's coming into Stochas. So you can have more than one MIDI device controlling Stochas here if you wanted to. If you had the routing to be able to create a multiple or a merging of MIDI. Can you merge MIDI? So you've got this MIDI mapping. And Stochas can be controlled by MIDI input. So under the patch options, you've got respond to MIDI, and that's when this MIDI mapping will come into play. And that's when you will need to set the MIDI mapping. Now, like any other synth or sample engine or other playback device, you can control them by different MIDI messages. Quite often, different key presses or note presses on a hardware controller will trigger an event or a change of something within the synth or the playback engine, and Stochas is exactly the same. So here you can assign which MIDI channel that Stochas is listening to, and then the MIDI note or CC value that Stochas is going to respond to on these two options here. So channel 1 and C0. You also get the learn button, so you click learn, press a note on your MIDI keyboard. I don't actually have one hooked up, so it won't actually show anything here. Press a note on your MIDI keyboard, and this will then change. Changing pattern. Sorry. Let's have a look at what actions you can control. So first of all, you can change pattern. Now you can assign this to all layers, so we can then select between 1 and 8 patterns, or you can nudge forward and back. You can also do this per layer. So you might have on layer 2, you might want to switch between back and forth between layer 2 because you've got a different baseline on those, but layer 1 you just want to keep on pattern 1. Next we have mute and unmute. So once again, you can mute all layers, or you can mute particular layers, and you can either turn the mute on, or you can unmute it depending on how you want your controller set up, or you can set it to toggle. So it'll just switch on and off with every key press or note press. Next we have set speed. So once again, because this is a layer option, you can change this between any of these values. So you can preset them to, so you can set them to a 1/16 of playback speed, or to 4 times playback speed, or you can nudge them up and down these measures using the double and half options. So you can double the speed or half the playback speed. Next we have Next we have transpose. Now transpose will change relative Now transpose will change by you can transpose by a number of different options. Firstly, transposing by 2 octaves or by a set number of semitones. This will change on an absolute value to the key that layer is in. So for example, if we are in the key of D major, and I set the transpose to -1 semitone, everything will move down that 1 semitone to C sharp major. However, if I was to then click have the setting for -2 semitones, it would not move down a further 2 semitones. This would change from -2 semitones from the D major and become a C major. If you want to nudge up and down through the transpositions, at the bottom you have up 1 semitone and down 1 semitone. So this will change relative to its current transposition. So if I have gone down 1 semitone and I've moved from the D to the C sharp major, and I want to move again down to the C major, but I don't want to use the -2 semitones, I can use the down 1 semitone. Next we have set number of steps. So in this we can change how many steps Stochas is going to play before it loops back around. So we have here 1 to 16 steps, so we can create our polymeters, And then we can set the larger values of 24, 32, 48 and 64, just in case we have more than the one bar. For instances, when we have written a pattern that could be 64 steps, but you want it to just loop the first 6 steps and then jump back to 64. Next we have the set polybias. Now this is set to a CC value, which means it is controlled by a MIDI controller, so it is set by a MIDI controller that can send MIDI values from 0 to 127, which is normally a dial, a slider, or a foot pedal. And the polybias is, as you probably remember, used to set how likely Stochas is to play a maximum number of poly, or maximum number of notes, or how likely it is to select between one note and the maximum number of notes that are set. Remember, the lower the bias, the more random that is. When it gets to 99, the higher value, the more likely, or in the instance of 99, it will play the maximum poly every time. And finally, we have a reset action. So let's say we've gone through and we've made a few changes. We've moved to pattern number 4 on layer 2. We've transposed everything across all the layers a couple of times. And now we want to get back to its original state because we're going to play that song again. Or we've moved from a transposed chorus and we want to jump back to the verse. So you've got a reset action and you can set that to any layer. So let's say we have moved layers on layer 2 and we've transposed on layer 2. And we want to set layer 2 back to being pattern 1 with no transposition. We've got the reset action and we set it to layer 2. And we can then select which of these we have. Oh no. And finally we have reset action. So let's say we've transposed down and we've been using layer 2's down 1 semitone, and we've changed patterns and nudged through to pattern 4. We've nudged the transpose on layer 2 to, let's say, to -4 semitones, and we want to bring this back to being how it was when we press play on Stochas without making any of these changes. Well, we've got reset action set to layer 2, and then we can set what we have changed here. So we can reset the transposition, and we can reset the change pattern. So this will then play or change back Stochas to the setup that we had when we pressed play. So if we are in pattern 2 and we press play, it will reset to this pattern that is selected at the point of playback. Okay, pass-through MIDI data. Now, at the moment I've got it set to none. So what that means is when I'm using a MIDI controller and I play a note that Stochas doesn't pick up on, Pass through MIDI data. What we've got here, we've got an all setting. And what this means is that when we play a note on our hardware controller, when we play a note on our MIDI controller, or we've written some MIDI into a MIDI track and that's been sent into Stochas, and it's done whatever it's going to do according to this MIDI mapping, it will also pass through that note. So let's say, for example, this mute on D0, oh no, actually let's say this change pattern here, C sharp 0, maybe we want that to go to pattern 2 and this is going to be pattern 1. We might have this assigned to change the expression in the synth or sample engine. For example, if you use any of the strings in any of the string libraries in Contact, you can find that it changes the expression from, let's say, staccato to legato. So you might have this set here to be a staccato pattern, and rather than having to press two different keys on your MIDI controller, you can set it so that Stochas listens to the same value that is needed for the playback engine to change. And by pressing one note, Stochas will listen and pass through that note and react to it, passing it through to the playback engine. Now, pass through MIDI data, we have with pass through MIDI data, we have the option for Stochas to be able to pass through any note that it listens to and responds to. For example, you might have here on this change pattern layer 2, you may have it, as I've got here, set to value 2, and this pattern might be a staccato pattern that's being played on a string patch. Now this MIDI note here can also be assigned to the same note that your playback engine is listening to for it to change from, let's say, a normal playback to staccato playback. So when we play this C sharp 0, Stochas is going to change to pattern 2, but it's also going to send this note through to the playback engine and change the patch to the staccato patch. And then when we change it back to layer 1, which could just be a normal playback, C0 here is going to be the same as whatever our playback engine is, and it takes back the playback engine to its normal playback, to its normal expression. Pass through MIDI data unhandled means that if any of these notes are, this means if you play on your MIDI controller or have any MIDI data coming into Stochas that Stochas responds to, it will not send that note through, but it will send any note that is not assigned through. So you might want to use this and have Stochas change patterns, but you might also want to be able to play something into that synth or that playback engine over the top using your MIDI controller. So for example, here we've got the 0 octave range being controlled or controlling Stochas, and we might want to play something on octave 3 and 4 over the top of a bass line that we've written in Stochas on octaves 2 and 3. So that's where you would use the unhandled. Pass through MIDI data none is exactly that. Any MIDI that comes into Stochas ends here in Stochas. It does not get passed through. So if you do have a lot of MIDI maps assigned, because Stochas can have up to 60 different Stochas can have up to 100 different. No. Let's read up. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10. $70, 80, 81, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 89 patterns. Okay. You can set Stochas to 89 patterns. Now, you can assign up to 88 different MIDI maps in Stochas. Now, one option you do see here on the patch options is